Good evening. Tonight, we're going back to a time when the world changed forever. When an empire fell and something new rose from its ashes. Something the world had never seen before. We're going to talk about the rise of the Soviet Union. Not the Cold War years. Not the superpower confrontation. But the beginning. The birth. The struggle. The years. When everything was uncertain. When millions of people tried to build something new while their world was falling apart around them. This is a story that spans 3 decades. From 1917 to 1945. From revolution to superpower. From chaos to control. And we're going to walk through it slowly, carefully, the way you might walk through a place where something profound happened. Because this isn't just about politics or ideology. It's about people. Ordinary. People living through extraordinary times. People who woke up one day and found their world had changed completely. People who had to decide what they believed in. What they were willing to fight for. What they were willing to sacrifice. So, settle in. Get comfortable. We have time. All the time in the world. And we're going to use it to understand what really happened. Not the simplified version. Not the propaganda. But the human story. The real story. The story of how the Soviet Union was born. Let me start by taking you back to Russia in 1917. To help you understand what happened, you need to know what the world was like before the revolution. Russia was an empire. The Russian Empire. One of the largest empires the world had ever seen. It stretched from Poland in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east. From the Arctic in the north to Central Asia in the south. Millions of square miles. Hundreds of millions of people. And it was ruled by one man. The Tsar. Nicholas II. Nicholas was an absolute monarch. He had complete power. There was no parliament with real authority. No democracy. No freedom of speech or press. The Tsar's word was law. And the Tsar believed he ruled by divine right. That God had chosen him to lead Russia. That his authority came from heaven itself. This was the old world. The world of kings and emperors and aristocrats. A world that was already dying in 1917. But Nicholas didn't see it. Didn't understand that his world was ending. Nicholas was a family man. He loved his wife, Alexandra, deeply. They had 5 children. 4 daughters and a son, Alexei. The boy was the heir. The future Tsar. But he was sick. He had hemophilia. A genetic disease where blood doesn't clot properly. A small cut could be fatal. There was no cure. And the family lived in constant fear for the boy's life. This fear made them vulnerable. Made them trust a strange man named Rasputin. A peasant mystic who seemed to be able to help the boy. To stop his bleeding episodes. Rasputin gained enormous influence over the royal family. Especially over the empress. And people hated him. Saw him as a symbol of everything wrong with the regime. Corrupt. Decadent. Out of touch. Most Russians were peasants. Farmers. They lived in villages scattered across the vast empire. Wooden houses. Dirt roads. Fields that stretched to the horizon. They worked the land, grew grain, raised animals. And they were poor. Desperately poor. Many lived in one-room huts. Families of 6 or 8 people sharing a single space. Sleeping on stoves in winter for warmth. Eating black bread and cabbage soup. Rarely eating meat. Most were illiterate. Couldn't read or write. Had never been more than a few miles from their village. They had no say in how they were governed. No rights to speak of. They paid heavy taxes. Gave much of their harvest to landlords who owned the land. And they lived the same way their grandparents had lived. The same way their great-grandparents had lived. For centuries, nothing had changed. Life was hard. Life was short. Most people didn't live past 40. Children died in infancy at alarming rates. Disease was common. Medical care was non-existent in most villages. And people accepted it because they'd never known anything different. This was the way things were. The way God had ordained them to be. But by 1917, things were changing. Russia was industrializing. Slowly. Much later than Western Europe. But it was happening. Factories were being built in cities like Moscow and Petersburg. Steel mills. Textile factories. Arms factories. Railroads were spreading across the vast empire, connecting cities that had been isolated for centuries. And with industrialization came a new class of people. Workers. Factory workers. Men and women. Who left their villages and moved to cities to work in factories. They lived in crowded tenements. Barracks, really. Rows of bunk beds. Dozens of people sharing a single room. They worked 12-hour shifts. Sometimes longer. 6 days a week. For wages that barely covered rent and food. The conditions in the factories were dangerous. Machines had no safety guards. Accidents were common. Workers lost fingers, arms, lives. And there was no compensation. No insurance. You worked until you couldn't work anymore. And then you starved. But the workers were different from the peasants. They were concentrated in cities. Worked together. Lived together. And concentration breeds consciousness. Breeds organization. Breeds discontent. Workers started forming illegal unions. Reading forbidden literature. Talking about socialism. About workers' rights. About revolution. The Tsarist police tried to suppress this. Arrested organizers. Shot down underground newspapers. Sent agitators to Siberia. But the ideas spread anyway. Because the conditions were so bad. Because people were so desperate. Because they could see that things didn't have to be this way. And then came the First World War. In August 1914, Russia entered the war. The Tsar declared it. The people supported it. At first, there was patriotism, enthusiasm. Men enlisted, marched off to fight Germany and Austria-Hungary. There were parades, flags, bands playing. It all seemed glorious. But the glory faded quickly. The war was a disaster for Russia. From the very beginning, the Russian army was brave. The soldiers fought hard. Russian officers led charges. Russian troops defended their positions with courage and determination. But they were poorly led. The officer corps was corrupt, incompetent. Appointments were based on family connections, not merit. Generals made terrible decisions, sent troops into hopeless situations. The army was poorly equipped. Many soldiers didn't have rifles, had to wait for a comrade to fall so they could pick up his weapon. There weren't enough bullets, weren't enough artillery shells, weren't enough boots. Soldiers marched barefoot in winter, wrapped their feet in rags, and they were poorly supplied. Food was irregular. Soldiers went hungry, went without warm clothing, without medical care. When they were wounded, there weren't enough doctors, weren't enough bandages, weren't enough hospitals. Wounded men lay in the mud, died from infections that could have been prevented. And they faced German troops with modern weapons and tactics. Machine guns, artillery, poison gas. The Russians were slaughtered. In the early battles, entire divisions were wiped out. Hundreds of thousands of men killed or captured in single engagements. The Battle of Tannenberg, the Masurian Lakes, the Gorlice-Tarnow Offensive. Names that meant nothing to most people then. That mean nothing to most people now. But each one was a catastrophe. Each one destroyed armies. Each one killed or captured hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers. By 1917, Russia had lost millions of soldiers, millions killed, millions wounded, millions captured. The exact numbers are unknown. Nobody kept accurate records, but estimates suggest 3 million dead, 5 million wounded, 2.5 million captured. These weren't just statistics. These were fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. Each death left a family bereft. Each wound left a man broken. Each capture left people not knowing, waiting, hoping, often in vain. The war devastated Russia. The economy collapsed. All resources went to the war effort. Factories made weapons instead of consumer goods. Railroads transported troops and supplies instead of food and fuel. Agriculture suffered because millions of young men were in the army, not working the fields. Food became scarce, especially in cities. People stood in line for hours to buy bread. Often there was no bread. Stores were empty. Prices skyrocketed. Inflation spiraled out of control. A loaf of bread that cost 5 kopecks before the war cost 50 kopecks. then a ruble, then 5 rubles. Wages couldn't keep up. People were hungry, cold, desperate. And they blamed the Tsar, blamed the government, blamed the aristocrats who seemed to do nothing while the people suffered, who held balls and banquets while soldiers died, who lived in palaces while workers froze in unheated tenements. The disconnect was enormous. The royal family lived in complete isolation, had no idea what ordinary people were going through. Nicholas visited troops at the front, thought morale was fine, thought the soldiers loved him. He didn't see the hatred, the resentment, the desperation. By early 1917, Russia was on the edge. Something had to break. The pressure was too great. The suffering too intense. The system too rotten. And in February, it did. It started with bread. Or rather, the lack of bread. Women in Petrograd, the capital, had been renamed from St. Petersburg at the start of the war. To sound less German. These women were waiting in line for bread. They'd been waiting for hours. In the cold. February in Russia is brutally cold. Snow on the ground. Wind cutting through thin coats. And when they got to the front of the line, they were told there was no bread. The bakery had run out. This happened again and again. Day after day. And the women got angry. Started protesting. Demanding bread. Demanding food for their children. This wasn't political at first. They weren't demanding revolution. They just wanted bread. Wanted to feed their families. But hunger can radicalize people. Can make them question. Can make them angry. The protests grew. On February 23rd, which was International Women's Day, thousands of women were in the streets. Marching. Chanting. Bread for our children. Peace for our husbands. Workers joined. Men from the factories. Students. The crowd swelled. The government ordered the police to disperse them. But the crowds were too large. Too determined. Police charges had no effect. The crowds just regrouped. Came back. The government grew nervous. Called in the Cossacks. Elite cavalry troops known for their loyalty to the Tsar. But even the Cossacks hesitated. Refused to charge the crowds. Some even smiled at the protesters. Tipped their hats. The government panicked. This had never happened before. The Cossacks always obeyed. Always suppressed protests. But not this time. Then the government called in regular army units. Infantry regiments stationed in the capital. Ordered them to fire on the protesters. To clear the streets. To restore order. And on Sunday, February 26th, troops opened fire. Killed dozens of protesters. Wounded hundreds. The streets ran with blood. It looked like the protest would be crushed. Like order would be restored. But something unexpected happened. That night, soldiers in the Pavlovsky regiment mutinied. They'd been ordered to fire on civilians, on women and children. And they refused. They killed their commanding officer, took their weapons, joined the protesters. Other units followed. The Volinsky Regiment, the Preobrazhensky Guards, the Litovsky Regiment. Within 48 hours, the entire Petrograd garrison had mutinied. Over 150,000 soldiers. They put down their guns, refused to obey their officers. Some arrested their officers. Some shot them. And they joined the revolution. Because that's what it had become now. A revolution. The Tsar had lost control of his own army, of his own capital. The government collapsed. Ministers fled, or went into hiding, or were arrested by revolutionary soldiers. The Duma, the parliament, took control, or tried to, formed a provisional committee, then a provisional government. The Tsar was at military headquarters, hundreds of miles from the capital. He didn't understand what was happening. Thought it was just a bread riot. Thought it could be suppressed. He ordered troops to march on Petrograd to restore order. But his generals told him it was hopeless, that the troops wouldn't obey, that the situation was out of control. They advised him to abdicate, to give up the throne, to save the monarchy by stepping aside. Let his son become Tsar. Let a regent rule until the boy came of age. Nicholas resisted, agonized, prayed. But he saw no other option. On March 2nd, he signed the abdication papers. But he didn't abdicate in favor of his son. He knew the boy was sick. Knew Alexei couldn't rule. Couldn't even survive without constant care. So he abdicated for both himself and his son. Passed the throne to his brother, Grand Duke Michael. But Michael refused it. Said he would only accept if a democratically elected assembly offered it to him, which they never would. So the monarchy ended. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. After 300 years, the Romanov dynasty was over. The Russian Empire was over. And nobody knew what would come next. A provisional government was formed, made up of liberal politicians from the Duma, led by Prince Lvov, later by Alexander Kerensky. They were well-meaning men, educated, Western-oriented. They promised democracy, elections for a constituent, assembly that would write a constitution, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, all the liberties that Western democracies enjoyed. And people were thrilled. This was what they'd been waiting for. Freedom at last. The February Revolution, they called it. The liberation. But the provisional government made a fatal mistake. They promised to continue the war, to honor Russia's commitments to Britain and France, to fight Germany until victory. This was politically necessary. They needed the support of the Allies, needed Western loans and supplies. But it was suicidal. Domestically, because the Russian people were exhausted. They'd been at war for 3 years, had lost millions of men, were starving, were freezing, and they wanted it to stop. Wanted peace. Wanted soldiers to come home. Wanted to focus on rebuilding, on survival. The provisional government also hesitated on land reform. The peasants had been demanding land for decades, wanted the great estates broken up and distributed. But the liberals in the government believed in property rights, believed changes should come legally, through proper legislative process. So they delayed, said land reform would wait until the Constituent Assembly was elected, until a proper government was formed. But peasants couldn't wait. They started seizing land on their own, driving out landlords, dividing estates among themselves. And the government couldn't stop them. Didn't have the force. Didn't have the authority. At the same time, workers and soldiers were forming their own organizations. Soviets, they called them. The Russian word for council. The Petrograd Soviet. The Moscow Soviet. Soviets in cities and towns and army units across Russia. These were democratic bodies, representatives elected by workers and soldiers. And they had real power. More power, in many ways, than the provisional government. When the Soviets said strike, workers struck. When the Soviets said, don't obey that order, soldiers didn't obey. Russia had 2 governments. Dual power, they called it. The provisional government had legal authority. The Soviets had actual power. And this couldn't last. Eventually, one would have to give way to the other. Into this chaos came Vladimir Lenin. Lenin had been in exile in Switzerland. Had been there for years. Working, writing, planning, building his revolutionary party. When news of the February Revolution reached him, he was desperate to get back to Russia. But how? Russia was at war with Germany. He couldn't travel through Germany. Or could he? The German government saw an opportunity. Lenin was calling for peace. If he got power in Russia, he might take Russia out of the war. And that would be enormously helpful to Germany. So the Germans arranged for Lenin to travel through Germany in a sealed train. Like a bacillus, Churchill later said, being sent to infect Russia. Lenin arrived at Finland Station in Petrograd on April 3, 1917. Thousands of people met him. Workers, soldiers, revolutionaries. He climbed onto an armored car and gave a speech calling for all power to the Soviets, calling for peace, calling for land redistribution, calling for an end to the provisional government, calling for a socialist revolution. His own party, the Bolsheviks, were shocked. They'd thought the February Revolution was enough, that Russia needed time, needed to develop capitalism, needed a democratic phase before socialism. But Lenin said no. Russia could leap directly to socialism, could skip stages. The time was now. Let me tell you more about Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. Born in 1870 in Simbirsk, a provincial town on the Volga River. His family was middle class, comfortable. His father was a school inspector, a civil servant, respected in the community. His mother was educated, well-read. The family had servants, had a nice house. Young Vladimir was a good student, excelled in school, was expected to have a successful career. But in 1887, everything changed. His older brother, Alexander, was arrested. He'd been part of a plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. The plot failed. Alexander was caught, tried, and hanged. He was 21 years old. This radicalized young Vladimir. His beloved older brother had been executed by the state for trying to change Russia, for fighting oppression. And Vladimir decided to carry on his brother's work, but differently. Alexander had been a terrorist, had believed in individual acts of violence. Lenin would be a revolutionary, would believe in mass movements, in organizing workers, in building a party. He studied law, but was more interested in revolutionary theory. Read Marx, read Engels, joined underground study groups, was arrested in 1895, spent a year in prison in Petersburg, then was exiled to Siberia for 3 years. Siberia wasn't as harsh as you might think, at least not for political exiles. Lenin lived in a village, had a cottage, could hunt, could read, could write. His future wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, joined him there. They married, spent their exile reading, discussing, planning. When his exile ended in 1900, Lenin left Russia, went to Western Europe, and stayed there for most of the next 17 years, living in London, in Geneva, in Paris, in Zurich, working on revolutionary newspapers, writing pamphlets, building the Bolshevik Party, waiting for his moment. Lenin was brilliant. No one disputes that. He could analyze complex situations, see connections others missed, write clearly and persuasively. But he was also ruthless, intolerant of dissent, convinced he was right, that he understood history, that he knew what had to be done. He split the Russian socialist movement over arcane doctrinal disputes, created the Bolsheviks as a separate party, a disciplined party, a party of professional revolutionaries, not a mass party, but a vanguard, an elite. Who would lead the masses? Who would make the revolution? Who would seize power in the name of the working class? When Lenin arrived back in Russia in April 1917, the Bolsheviks were a small party, maybe 25,000 members, compared to millions of workers and soldiers. But they were organized, disciplined, clear in their message. And Lenin's message was simple: peace, land, bread, All power to the Soviets. End the war. Redistribute the land. Give workers control of factories. This resonated, especially with soldiers who were tired of fighting, who wanted to go home, who deserted in increasing numbers. Whole units left the front, walked away. The army was dissolving. The provisional government grew weaker, tried to launch a military offensive in June. A last effort to win the war, to restore morale. It was a disaster. Russian troops attacked, gained some ground initially. Then, the Germans counterattacked, drove the Russians back, inflicted heavy casualties. Morale collapsed completely. Soldiers refused to fight, killed officers who tried to force them. The front disintegrated, and the Bolsheviks grew stronger. They dominated the Soviets in major cities, won elections for Soviet deputies, spread their message through newspapers and speeches and agitation. In July, there was an uprising in Petrograd. Workers and soldiers tried to seize power, demanded the Soviets take control. The Bolsheviks weren't quite ready. The party leadership tried to restrain the masses, but also tried to lead them. It was confused, half-hearted. The provisional government suppressed it, arrested Bolshevik leaders. Lenin fled, went into hiding in Finland. It looked like the Bolshevik moment had passed, that the revolution had failed. But appearances were deceiving. The crisis continued, deepened. In September, General Kornilov, the commander-in-chief of the army, attempted a military coup. He marched troops toward Petrograd, intended to dissolve the Soviet, restore order, establish a military dictatorship. But the coup failed. Railway workers refused to transport his troops. Soldiers refused to fight. Agitators convinced them not to attack their fellow workers. Kornilov was arrested. But the Kornilov affair showed how fragile the provisional government was, how divided Russia was. And it pushed the Bolsheviks to the left, made them seem like defenders of the revolution, gave them legitimacy. By October, the Bolsheviks were ready. Lenin returned from Finland, went into hiding in Petrograd, and pushed the party to act, to seize power before the Constituent Assembly elections, before a democratic government could be established. He argued that the provisional government was finished, that power was lying in the streets, that the Bolsheviks just had to pick it up. Some in the party disagreed, wanted to wait, wanted to work through legal channels. But Lenin was insistent, threatening to resign if they didn't act. And eventually, the party agreed. On the night of October 24th to 25th, 1917, by the old Russian calendar, the Bolsheviks made their move. It wasn't really a revolution in the dramatic sense that we imagine. There were no massive street battles, no heroic charges, no barricades in the streets. It was more like a takeover, a coup. Bolshevik workers and soldiers, organized as Red Guards and military units loyal to the Soviet, seized key points in Petrograd: the telegraph office, the telephone exchange, the post office, the bridges over the Neva River, the railway stations, the power plants, the banks. They did it quietly, methodically, meeting little resistance, because the provisional government had no forces to defend itself, no troops willing to fight for it. And then, in the early morning hours of October 26th, the Red Guards and soldiers stormed the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government, where the ministers were meeting, trying to figure out what to do. The palace was defended by a few hundred cadets, military academy students, and a women's battalion. They resisted for a few hours, then surrendered. The ministers were arrested, walked out with their hands up, sent to prison. The provisional government was over. Just like that. The Bolsheviks were in power, and Lenin could proclaim that the workers and peasants had taken control of Russia. Immediately, Lenin issued decrees. A decree on peace, calling for an immediate end to the war, proposing a peace without annexations or indemnities, a just peace, a decree on land, legalizing the peasant seizures of landlord estates, abolishing private ownership of land, making all land the property of the people. These were popular measures. They gave people what they wanted, what they'd been demanding. And they showed that the Bolsheviks were serious, were different, were willing to act. But not everyone accepted Bolshevik rule. How could they? The Bolsheviks had taken power by force, through a coup. They represented a minority of the population. Most Russians hadn't voted for them, didn't support them, and many actively opposed them. Liberals who wanted democracy, moderate socialists who thought the Bolsheviks had betrayed the revolution, monarchists who wanted to restore the Tsar, generals who wanted order, landlords who wanted their land back, national minorities who wanted independence. All these groups began to organize, to resist, and within months, Russia descended into civil war. The Russian Civil War lasted from 1918 to 1920. It wasn't a single war. It was dozens of wars, fought on multiple fronts, by multiple armies, with shifting allegiances and unclear battle lines. The Reds, the Bolsheviks and their supporters, fighting to preserve the revolution, to build socialism. The Whites, anti-Bolshevik forces of various types, monarchists, Democrats, nationalists, fighting to overthrow the Reds. Green armies, peasant forces, fighting everyone, just wanting to be left alone. National armies, Ukrainians, Poles, Finns, Baltic peoples, fighting for independence. Foreign armies, British, French, American, Japanese, Czech, intervening on the side of the Whites, or just trying to grab what they could. Let me tell you what the Civil War was like for ordinary people. It was hell. Imagine you're a peasant in a village in Ukraine. Before the war, your life was hard but stable. You worked the land, paid your taxes, went to church, raised your family. When the revolution came, you seized land from the local landlord, joined the other peasants in dividing it up. You felt like finally, after centuries, the land was yours. You could work it for yourself, feed your family properly, maybe even prosper. But then the Civil War came, and your village became a battlefield, a place that armies passed through, took from, destroyed. First, the Reds came. The Bolsheviks. They demanded food, grain, to feed their soldiers, to feed the cities. They called it requisitioning. But it was just taking. They took your harvest, most of it, left you barely enough to survive the winter. You were angry. But what could you do? They had guns. They had soldiers. If you resisted, they shot you. Called you a kulak, an enemy of the people. Took everything. Burned your house. Maybe killed you. A few weeks later, another army came. The Whites. This time, led by a general who wanted to restore the old order. They also demanded food. Also took your harvest. And they punished you for cooperating with the Reds. Beat you. Accused you of being a Bolshevik sympathizer. Maybe shot some villagers as a warning, as an example. And then they moved on. Left you with even less. Left you wondering how you'd survive. Then the Reds came back. And the cycle continued. Back and forth. Red Army, White Army, Green Army, Foreign Army. Each one taking. Each one demanding. Each one punishing. Your village was raided 12 times. 2 dozen times. You lost count. You lost everything. Your grain. Your animals. Your tools. Your house was burned. Your neighbors were killed. Your children starved. You ate grass, tree bark, boiled leather, anything to survive. And still the armies came. And still they took. And still you endured. Because what else could you do? Or imagine you're a worker in a factory in Petrograd, now called Moscow. Sorry, no, Petrograd was still Petrograd. The capital would be moved to Moscow in March 1918. But you're in Petrograd. You supported the Bolsheviks, cheered when they took power, believed they would make things better for workers, believed in the revolution. The factory was nationalized, taken over by a workers' committee. You felt proud, felt like finally you had a say. Finally you were in control. But then the Civil War started, and the economy collapsed completely. There were no raw materials, no fuel, no way to keep production going. The factory closed. You were out of work. No wages. No income. Your family was hungry. You tried to find food. Stood in endless lines. Often, there was nothing. The shops were empty. People were starving in the cities, especially in Petrograd and Moscow. Hundreds of thousands died from starvation and disease in those years. You heard about villages that had food, grain, hidden from the requisitioners. So you left the city, walked to the countryside, trying to trade, trying to barter. You had a coat, some shoes, a watch. You traded them for a sack of grain, carried it back to the city, fed your family for a month, then had to go again. The city was dying. Literally dying. The population of Petrograd fell from 2.5 million to 700,000. Where did they go? Some fled to the countryside. Some died. The streets were empty. Buildings were abandoned. People burned furniture for heat, tore down wooden houses for firewood. The water system broke down. Sewage in the streets. Disease everywhere. Typhus, cholera, smallpox, the Spanish flu. Bodies lay in the streets. Nobody had the strength to bury them. And you tried to survive, day by day, wondering if tomorrow would be your last. The Bolsheviks, now calling themselves communists, fought desperately to hold on to power. They created the Red Army, led by Leon Trotsky, a brilliant organizer and strategist. Trotsky had been a Menshevik, had opposed Lenin for years, but joined the Bolsheviks in 1917, became Lenin's right-hand man. When the Civil War started, Trotsky was put in charge of building an army. And he did. From almost nothing. He conscripted workers, peasants, used former Imperial Army officers as commanders, held their families hostage to ensure loyalty. If an officer deserted or betrayed, his family was shot. Trotsky traveled constantly in an armored train, visiting fronts, rallying troops, executing deserters, rewarding bravery. He was everywhere, seemed to be everywhere at once. And his energy, his leadership, his ruthlessness, kept the Red Army together, kept it fighting. The Red Army grew rapidly, from tens of thousands to millions. By 1920, 5 million men were in the Red Army. Most conscripted, many unwilling, but disciplined by terror, by ideology, by survival. If the Reds lost, they'd all be killed. So they fought. The Reds used terror systematically. The Cheka, the secret police, led by Felix Dzerzhinsky, a Polish revolutionary, fanatical, committed. The Cheka arrested suspected enemies, thousands of them, tens of thousands, people who'd been officials under the Tsar, people who'd opposed the Bolsheviks, people whose only crime was being in the wrong class. being an aristocrat, being a bourgeois, being an intellectual. The Cheka executed them. Without trial. Without evidence. Just on suspicion. The Red Terror, it was called. And it was terrible. Estimates suggest 50,000 to 200,000 people were executed by the Cheka during the Civil War. Maybe more. Nobody knows the exact number. But the whites used terror too. They committed terrible atrocities, especially against Jews. Blamed Jews for the revolution, for Bolshevism. In Ukraine, white forces and Ukrainian nationalist forces carried out pogroms, massacred entire Jewish communities. Hundreds of pogroms. Tens of thousands of Jews killed. Maybe 100,000. It was genocide. And the whites killed peasants and workers too. Anyone suspected of supporting the Bolsheviks. Entire villages were wiped out. People were hanged, shot, burned alive. The Civil War became a spiral of violence and counter-violence, revenge and counter-revenge. And ordinary people suffered most. The whites had advantages. They controlled the grain-producing regions of the South and Siberia. They had support from foreign powers. Britain and France sent weapons, supplies, money, even troops. British forces intervened in the north, in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. French forces in the south. Japanese and American forces in Siberia. The Czech Legion, former POWs who'd been fighting for the Allies, controlled the Trans-Siberian Railway. All this help should have been enough. Should have allowed the whites to win. But they didn't. They failed. Why? Several reasons. The whites were divided. They had different goals, different visions for Russia. General Denikin in the south wanted to restore the Russian Empire, but not the monarchy. Admiral Kolchak in Siberia was more conservative. Some whites were monarchists, wanted to bring back the Tsar. Others were Democrats, wanted a democratic republic. They couldn't agree, couldn't coordinate, fought separate campaigns, allowed the Reds to defeat them one by one. The Reds controlled the center of Russia, the heartland, the industrial areas, Moscow and Petrograd, the railway hub. They could move troops and supplies more easily, could concentrate forces, could respond to threats. The Reds had unity of command. Lenin and Trotsky. A clear hierarchy, clear goals. The whites had competing generals, competing politicians. No overall leadership, no coordination. And the Reds were more motivated. They believed they were fighting for the future, for socialism, for a better world. The whites were fighting to restore the past, to bring back a system most people hated. So soldiers fought harder for the Reds, believed more, endured more. By 1920, the major white armies were defeated. Kolchak was captured in January 1920. Executed by the Reds. Shot and thrown into a river. Denikin was pushed back. Evacuated with his remaining forces from the Crimea. Fled into exile. The last white forces held out in the Far East until 1922. But they were isolated. Cut off. Eventually defeated. The Reds had won. The Civil War was over. The Communists controlled Russia. But Russia was destroyed. The economy had collapsed completely. Industrial production in 1920 was 13% of what it had been in 1913. 13%. Agriculture was devastated. The harvest in 1920 was only half of what it had been in 1913. Millions had died in fighting, from disease, from starvation. Estimates suggest 8 to 10 million dead. Military and civilian. Red and white. Russian and non-Russian. The population of Russia had fallen from 160 million to 130 million. 30 million people. Gone. Dead. Fled. Disappeared. And then came the famine of 1921 to 1922. The worst famine in Russian history. Maybe 5 million people died. Maybe 10 million. Nobody knows. The Volga region was hit hardest. The grain-producing areas. The communists had requisitioned so much grain during the Civil War that peasants had nothing left. No seed grain. No food. And the harvest failed. Drought made it worse. Entire regions faced starvation. People ate anything. Grass. Weeds. Tree bark. They boiled leather belts and shoes to make soup. They ate cats and dogs. Then rats and mice. And when there was nothing else, some turned to cannibalism. Ate the dead. Killed the weak to eat them. It was hell on earth. The government did almost nothing at first. Denied the famine was happening. Called reports of starvation bourgeois propaganda. But eventually, they had to admit it. Had to ask for foreign aid. Western organizations responded. The American Relief Administration, led by Herbert Hoover, sent food. Saved millions of lives. But millions still died. Children especially. The old. The weak. In some villages, half the population died. In others, everyone died. Entire villages were emptied. Houses stood empty. Fields lay fallow. And when the famine finally ended, in 1923, Russia was a land of ghosts. In the face of this catastrophe, Lenin changed course. He'd been implementing war communism during the Civil War. Total state control of the economy. Requisitioning of grain. Nationalization of all industry. Prohibition of private trade. It was necessary during the war, he argued. But it had failed. The economy had collapsed. People were starving. Rebellions were breaking out. In March 1921, sailors at the Kronstadt naval base mutinied. These were elite revolutionary sailors. Had supported the Bolsheviks in 1917. But now they rebelled. Demanded political freedom. Free elections to the Soviets. Freedom for socialist parties. The communist government crushed the rebellion. Thousands of sailors were killed or arrested. But it was a warning. If even the revolutionary sailors were turning against them, something had to change. So Lenin introduced the New Economic Policy, NEP, announced at the 10th Party Congress in March 1921. It was a partial return to capitalism. A strategic retreat, Lenin called it. Peasants would no longer have their grain requisitioned. They would pay a tax in kind, a fixed amount, and could sell the surplus on the market. Small businesses were allowed to operate privately. Shops, restaurants, small factories. Private trade was permitted. Markets reopened. People could buy and sell. The state would control the commanding heights of the economy. Heavy industry, banks, foreign trade. But small-scale capitalism was allowed. Encouraged even. It worked. The economy began to recover. Food became available. Again. Markets filled with goods. Restaurants opened. Life began to stabilize. By the mid-1920s, the economy had recovered to pre-war levels. Industrial production was back. Agricultural production was back. People were eating again. Living again. The NEP years were relatively good years. People had some freedom, some prosperity, some hope. But the NEP created contradictions. How could you build socialism while allowing capitalism? How could you have a workers' state while allowing private business? The Communist Party was divided. Some, like Nikolai Bukharin, argued that NEP should continue indefinitely. That Russia needed a long period of capitalist development. That socialism would come gradually. Others, like Leon Trotsky, argued that NEP was temporary. That Russia needed rapid industrialization. Needed to build socialism quickly. And that you couldn't do that while allowing capitalism. And then, in January 1924, Lenin died. He'd had a series of strokes starting in 1922. Each one worse than the last. By 1923, he was largely incapacitated. Couldn't speak clearly. Couldn't write. Couldn't work. He died on January 21, 1924. He was only 53 years old. But the years of exile, of revolution, of civil war, of stress, had worn him out. His death created a crisis. Who would lead? Lenin had been the revolution. The party. The state. Everything had revolved around him. And now he was gone. The obvious successor seemed to be Leon Trotsky. He was brilliant, charismatic, the creator of the Red Army, a powerful speaker and writer, internationally known, respected by revolutionaries around the world. But Trotsky had weaknesses. He was arrogant, dismissive of others, had made enemies in the party, and he was a recent Bolshevik, had only joined in 1917. Others had been with Lenin since the early days. Since the split with the Mensheviks, they resented Trotsky's prominence, his fame, his closeness to Lenin. And Trotsky underestimated a quiet, methodical man named Joseph Stalin. Stalin had been in the party since the early days, had been arrested multiple times under the Tsar, exiled to Siberia, escaped, been arrested again. He'd worked underground, organized strikes, robbed banks to fund the party, done the dirty work that intellectuals like Lenin wrote about but didn't do themselves. During the Revolution and Civil War, Stalin had held various posts: Commissar of Nationalities, worked on military matters. Nothing spectacular, but he'd been reliable, steady. Lenin trusted him, made him General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922. General Secretary seemed like a bureaucratic position. Administrative, unimportant. But Stalin used it brilliantly. He controlled party appointments, could decide who got which positions. And he used this power to place his allies throughout the party structure, in key positions, in regional organizations, in the Central Committee. He built a network of support, a machine. And when the struggle for succession began after Lenin's death, Stalin was ready. Stalin formed alliances with other party leaders, with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. Together, they isolated Trotsky, accused him of factionalism, of trying to divide the party. Trotsky fought back, argued for permanent revolution, for spreading the revolution internationally, for rapid industrialization. But he lost. By 1925, he'd been removed from his position as Commissar of War. By 1926, he'd been expelled from the Politburo. By 1927, he'd been expelled from the party. By 1929, he'd been exiled from the Soviet Union. Then Stalin turned on his former allies, accused Zinoviev and Kamenev of being right-wing deviationists, had them removed from power. Then he turned on Bukharin and the right opposition, who wanted to continue NEP, to go slowly. Stalin accused them of being soft on capitalism, of betraying the revolution, and removed them too. By the late 1920s, Stalin was the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. All potential rivals had been defeated. The party was his. The state was his. And he had plans. Stalin believed the Soviet Union was in danger, surrounded by hostile capitalist powers. That war was inevitable. That the Soviet Union needed to industrialize rapidly, to catch up with the West, to build a modern economy, a modern military, to be able to defend itself. And he believed this had to happen quickly. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries, he said. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or we shall be crushed. This was in 1931. And he was right. In 10 years, Germany would invade. And if the Soviet Union hadn't industrialized, it would have been crushed. So Stalin ended NEP, ended the compromises with capitalism, and launched the first 5-year plan, a program of crash industrialization. Build factories, steel mills, coal mines, power plants, tractor factories, arms factories. Build them everywhere. Build them fast. Meet quotas. Exceed quotas. Transform the Soviet Union from an agricultural country into an industrial power. The plan was incredibly ambitious. Called for massive increases in production. Coal up 300%. Steel up 300%. Machinery up 700%. It seemed impossible. But Stalin pushed, demanded, threatened. To achieve this, he needed resources. Capital, labor, food. And he decided to get these from the peasants. By collectivizing agriculture. Forcing peasants to give up their individual farms. To join collective farms. Kolkhozes. The idea was that collective farms would be more efficient. Would use machinery. Tractors. Combines. Would produce more with less labor. And the surplus could be taken by the state. Used to feed industrial workers. Exported for hard currency to buy machinery. It sounded rational on paper. But in practice, it was catastrophic. The peasants resisted. They didn't want to give up their land, their farms, their independence. The land they'd fought for, had seized in 1917, had worked for years. Now the government wanted to take it back, force them into collectives. They refused. Stalin responded with force. Sent in the army, the OGPU, the secret police, began a campaign against kulaks, rich peasants. Though the definition of kulak was flexible. Anyone who opposed collectivization was a kulak. Anyone who had a few extra cows, a slightly larger farm, anyone the local party official didn't like. Hundreds of thousands of kulak families were arrested. Their property confiscated. They were deported to Siberia, to Kazakhstan, to the far north, to harsh, remote regions, put in labor camps, or just dumped in the wilderness, told to fend for themselves. Many died from cold, from starvation, from disease. Nobody knows how many. Estimates range from 1 to 2 million. The rest of the peasants were forced into collectives at gunpoint. Entire villages collectivized. Land pooled. Animals pooled. Equipment pooled. The party sent 25,000 workers, the 25,000ers, to the countryside to organize collectivization. Most knew nothing about farming. But they had authority, had guns, and they forced compliance. The peasants fought back the only way they could. They slaughtered their livestock, killed their cows, their pigs, their horses, their sheep, ate them, sold them, anything, rather than give them to the collective. It was a catastrophe. The Soviet Union lost half its livestock between 1928 and 1933. Half. Tens of millions of animals gone. Agricultural production collapsed. There were fewer animals to pull plows, less fertilizer, less meat, less milk, less wool. The collective farms were chaos. Nobody knew what to do. Equipment broke down. No one to fix it. Seeds weren't planted on time. Harvests weren't brought in properly. Production fell. And then came the famine. The terrible famine of 1932 to 33. Especially severe in Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. The famine was partly a result of collectivization, disorganization, poor harvests. But it was also deliberate. Stalin's government continued to requisition grain even as people starved. They needed grain to feed the cities, to export, to get hard currency for machinery. So they took it. All of it. Left nothing for the peasants. And when people started to starve, the government sealed the borders of Ukraine. Prevented people from leaving. From going to find food elsewhere. Blocked aid. Let people die. Millions died. For million. 5 million. Some estimates say 7 million. Nobody knows exactly. Entire villages died. People ate grass, leaves, bark. The dead. Cannibalism became common. Parents ate their children. Children ate their parents. It was unspeakable horror. The Holodomor, Ukrainians call it. The hunger extermination. And many historians call it genocide. A deliberate policy to break Ukrainian resistance. To destroy Ukrainian national identity. To force submission. Stalin knew it was happening. Got reports. Didn't care. Or rather, saw it as necessary. As the cost of progress. If some people had to die to build socialism, so be it. He was building a new world. And you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. That's what he said. Those words. Chilling in their callousness. Millions of people weren't people to him. They were eggs. To be broken. In service of his grand vision. But the industrialization did happen. Factories were built across the Soviet Union. In the Urals. In Siberia. In Central Asia. Magnitogorsk. A steel city built from nothing. In the middle of nowhere. Thousands of workers and prisoners built it. In brutal conditions. In freezing cold. With inadequate food and shelter. But they built. Because they believed. Or because they were forced. Or because they had no choice. The 5-year plan called for producing 4 million tons of steel. They produced 6 million. Production targets were met. exceeded. The Soviet Union was being transformed. New cities appeared. Industrial cities. Komsomolsk-on-Amur. Built. In the Far East by young communist volunteers and prisoners. In swamps. In forests. They built in impossible conditions. And they built fast. By 1937, 10 years into Stalin's industrialization drive, the Soviet Union had become one of the world's leading industrial powers. Could produce its own steel, its own machines, its own trucks and tractors and tanks and planes. The transformation was real, was extraordinary, but the cost was staggering. The Gulag system expanded enormously under Stalin. The labor camps. Prisoners were used as forced labor to build canals. The White Sea-Baltic Canal, built by prisoners. Tens of thousands died building it. The Moscow-Volga Canal. Same thing. Timber. Camps in the far north. Gold mines in Kolyma. The coldest inhabited place on Earth. Prisoners worked in temperatures of -50 degrees. Without proper clothing. On starvation rations. Died in huge numbers. By the late 1930s, there were over 1 million people in the Gulag. By the end of Stalin's rule, the number would reach 2.5 million. Millions passed through the camps over the years. Many didn't come out. And in the mid-1930s, Stalin launched the Great Purge, the Great Terror. He became convinced that enemies were everywhere. Inside the party. Inside the government. Inside the military. Saboteurs. Spies. Trotskyites. Wreckers. People trying to undermine socialism. Trying to restore capitalism. Trying to overthrow him. It was paranoia. Partly. But also calculation. Stalin wanted absolute power. Wanted to eliminate any potential rivals. Any potential opposition. Anyone who might challenge him. So he struck. The Great Terror began with the murder of Sergei Kirov, the party boss in Leningrad. Killed in December 1934. Probably on Stalin's orders, though this has never been proven. Stalin used Kirov's murder as a pretext. Claimed there was a vast conspiracy. Demanded investigations. Arrests. Show trials began. Old Bolsheviks. Lenin's comrades. People who'd made the revolution. Zinoviev. Kamenev. Bukharin. Rykov. They were accused of fantastic crimes. Of plotting with Trotsky. Of plotting with foreign intelligence services. Of sabotage. Of trying to restore capitalism. Of trying to assassinate Stalin. The trials were staged. Scripted. The accused confessed. Under torture. Under threats to their families. They confessed to crimes they hadn't committed. Implicated others. The confessions were absurd. Contradictory. But it didn't matter. They were found guilty. Executed. Shot in the basement of Lubyanka prison. The Terror expanded, spread throughout the party, throughout the government, throughout society. Thousands were arrested, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Lists of names were prepared. Quotas for arrests. 4. Executions. Regional officials were told to arrest so many people, execute so many. They complied, exceeded their quotas, arrested more to be safe, to show loyalty. The terror was arbitrary. You could be arrested for anything. 4. Having traveled abroad before the revolution. For knowing someone who'd been arrested. For being related to someone who'd been arrested. For telling a joke about Stalin. For being late to work. For failing to meet a production quota. The accusations didn't have to make sense. People confessed to avoid torture, to protect their families. They implicated others, named names, and those people were arrested. And the cycle continued. Between 1936 and 1938, over 1.5 million people were arrested. At least 700,000 were executed. Millions more were sent to the Gulag. The Communist Party was devastated. Half the party members were arrested. The military was gutted. Most of the senior officers were arrested and shot, including some of the best commanders. Marshal Tukhachevsky, Commander Blucher, Admiral Orlov. 3. Of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, all 8 admirals, 50 of 57 corps commanders, 154 of 186 division commanders. The Red Army was beheaded. This would have terrible consequences when war came. But for now, Stalin was secure. He'd eliminated all potential rivals, all opposition, real or imagined. The Soviet Union was his. Completely. Totally. He was worshipped as a genius, a living god. His portraits were everywhere. In every office, every school, every factory, every home. His name was in every speech, every song, every poem. Stalin the great leader. Stalin the wise teacher. Stalin the father of the peoples. Any criticism was treason, punishable by death. People spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones. Even in private. Even among friends. Because you never knew who might inform, who might report you, who might save themselves by denouncing you. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had been utterly transformed. It was an industrial power, a military power. Factories churned out tanks and planes and weapons. The Red Army, despite the purges, was huge. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and planes. On paper, it was one of the strongest militaries in the world. But it was also a totalitarian state, a police state, a state where the government controlled everything, every aspect of life. What you could say, what you could read, what job, You had where you lived, who you could marry. The Communist Party controlled everything. And Stalin controlled the party. The Soviet Union was also isolated. Stalin had abandoned the idea of world revolution, had adopted socialism in one country, focused on building up the Soviet Union rather than spreading revolution abroad. This put him at odds with Trotsky and the left opposition. But it was pragmatic. The revolution hadn't spread. Workers in other countries hadn't risen up. The Soviet Union was alone, surrounded by capitalist powers, hostile powers, powers that wanted to see it fail. So, Stalin built socialism in one country, built up Soviet power, prepared for the inevitable war. And war did come. In Europe, Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany in 1933. He was openly anti-communist, saw Bolshevism as an existential threat, talked about destroying the Soviet Union, about colonizing the East, about enslaving the Slavic peoples. Stalin knew Hitler was dangerous, tried to build alliances against him, proposed collective security with Britain and France. But the Western powers didn't trust Stalin, didn't trust the Soviet Union, and they were more afraid of communism than of fascism. So they appeased Hitler. Let him rearm Germany. Let him take Austria. Let him take Czechoslovakia. Hoped he would turn east, fight the Soviet Union, solve their problem for them. Stalin saw this, realized the West wouldn't help, might even encourage Hitler to attack the Soviet Union. So he made a shocking move. In August 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers who signed it. Publicly, it was a non-aggression pact. Germany and the Soviet Union promised not to attack each other. But there was a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be split. The Baltic states would go to the Soviet Union. Parts of Romania would be taken. It was cynical, brutal, but Stalin saw it as buying time, as keeping the Soviet Union out of the war, as letting Germany and the Western powers fight each other, while the Soviet Union prepared. 2 weeks after Germany invaded Poland from the west in September 1939, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. The Polish army, already fighting the Germans, was overwhelmed. Poland was conquered, divided, ceased to exist as a state. The Soviet Union annexed eastern Poland, brought millions of new people, including over 1 million Poles and hundreds of thousands of Jews, under Soviet control. Many were arrested, deported. The NKVD, the secret police, carried out mass arrests. 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals were executed in the Katyn Forest and other locations. Shot in the back of the head, buried in mass graves. Then Stalin turned to the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. In June 1940, the Soviet Union occupied them, forced them to accept Soviet troops, rigged elections, installed communist governments, then annexed them, made them Soviet republics. Finland was next. Stalin demanded territorial concessions, military bases. Finland refused. So in November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded. The Winter War was supposed to be easy, a walkover. The Soviet Union had enormous advantages. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, thousands of planes. Finland had a tiny army, barely equipped. But the Finns fought brilliantly, used the terrain, the forests, the snow. They knew their country, knew how to fight in winter. Soviet columns advanced on narrow roads through forests. The Finns ambushed them, cut them off, destroyed them. The Battle of Suomussalmi. An entire Soviet division was annihilated. The Red Army, already weakened by Stalin's purges, performed terribly. Commanders were incompetent. Tactics were rigid. Soldiers froze, starved, died in huge numbers. The world watched. The Soviet military looked weak, incompetent. The purges had destroyed the officer corps, killed the best commanders, left the army led by yes-men, by people chosen for loyalty rather than competence. Hitler watched and drew conclusions. If the Red Army performed so poorly against Little Finland, how would it perform against Germany? Maybe the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay. Maybe it could be knocked over with one good kick. This was a fatal miscalculation, but understandable given what the Winter War revealed. Eventually, the Soviet Union won through sheer numbers, threw more and more troops into Finland, overwhelmed the Finns. Finland sued for peace in March 1940, ceded territory, gave up military bases, but remained independent. The war had cost the Soviet Union dearly. Over 125,000 dead. Over 264,000 wounded. Against a country with a population of 4 million. It was embarrassing. Revealed serious weaknesses in the Red Army. And those weaknesses would be exploited. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers. The largest invasion in history. Supported by hundreds of thousands of troops from Germany's allies. Romanians, Italians, Hungarians, Finns, Slovaks. They attacked along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Over 1,800 miles. And they struck with devastating effect. The Soviet forces were caught completely unprepared. Despite warnings, despite intelligence reports, Stalin had convinced himself that Hitler wouldn't attack, that the non-aggression pact would hold, at least for a while longer. He'd ignored warnings from his own intelligence services, from British intelligence, from a German defector who'd crossed the lines the night before to warn of the attack. Stalin thought it was disinformation, a provocation. He ordered his forces not to respond to provocations. not to be drawn into war. So when the attack came, the Red Army was unprepared. Units were not at battle readiness, were caught in barracks. In training, aircraft were lined up on airfields. Easy targets. In the first hours of the invasion, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most on the ground. Communications were disrupted. Commanders didn't know what was happening. Orders didn't get through. Units were cut off, encircled, destroyed. The Germans advanced rapidly, using blitzkrieg tactics. Fast-moving panzer divisions, supported by air power. They punched through Soviet lines, encircled huge numbers of troops. In the first 3 weeks, the Germans encircled and captured over 300,000 Soviet soldiers near Minsk, another 300,000 near Smolensk. Entire armies disappeared. Stalin was in shock. For the first few days, he couldn't function. Locked himself away. Couldn't believe what was happening. His generals came to him, told him the situation was desperate, that the front was collapsing, that the Germans were advancing toward Moscow, toward Leningrad. He raged, blamed them, threatened them. But eventually, he pulled himself together, took control, rallied the country. On July 3rd, he gave a radio address, his first public statement since the invasion. He called on the Soviet people to resist, to fight a patriotic war, not a communist war, but a war to defend the motherland, to defend Russia itself. The Soviet people responded. They'd suffered under Stalin. Millions had died in the famines, in the purges, in the Gulag. They had every reason to hate the regime. But when the Germans came, they fought. Because the Germans were worse. The Nazis saw the Slavic peoples as subhuman, unto mention, to be enslaved or exterminated. This was a war of annihilation, a race war. There would be no mercy, no quarter, and the Soviet people knew it. So they fought with desperation, with fury, because they knew what defeat meant. The government evacuated industries from the western regions, dismantled factories, put them on trains, moved them east, beyond the Urals, to Siberia, to Kazakhstan, to Central Asia. An enormous undertaking. Over 1,500 factories were moved. Millions of workers relocated. They worked day and night to get the factories running again, to produce weapons, tanks, planes, ammunition, everything the Red Army needed. Women worked in the factories, replacing men who'd gone to fight. Worked 12-hour shifts, 14-hour shifts. Slept in the factories, produced weapons, kept the army supplied. In Moscow, the situation was desperate. German forces were approaching the capital. By October, they were within sight of the city. The government prepared to evacuate, moved east to Kubyshev on the Volga. But Stalin stayed. His staying steadied the city, showed that he wasn't abandoning Moscow. The Red Army threw everything into the defense. Workers were mobilized, given rifles, sent to dig trenches, build fortifications. 3 lines of defense were built around Moscow. Anti-tank ditches, pillboxes, barbed wire. And when the German attack came in November, the city held. The battle for Moscow raged through November and into December. The Germans got close. Very close. In some places, they were within 15 miles of the Kremlin. But they couldn't break through. The Red Army held. And then winter came. The harsh Russian winter. The Germans weren't prepared. Their supply lines were stretched. Their tanks froze. Their soldiers froze. Frostbite decimated their ranks. And the Red Army counterattacked. Brought in fresh troops from Siberia. Troops equipped for winter. They pushed the Germans back. Saved Moscow. It was the first major German defeat of the war. Proved the Wehrmacht wasn't invincible. Gave hope to the Soviet people. But Leningrad was cut off. Surrounded. The Germans laid siege to the city in September 1941. And the siege would last 900 days. Until January 1944. Over 1 million people died in Leningrad during the siege. Most from starvation. The city was completely cut off. No food could get in. By winter, people were getting 125 grams of bread per day. 4 ounces. And the bread was mostly sawdust and cellulose. There was no meat. No vegetables. No fat. Nothing. People starved. Quickly. You could see it happening. People became skeletal. Couldn't walk. Collapsed in the streets. Died where they fell. Bodies were everywhere. The city couldn't keep up with burying them. The ground was frozen. Digging graves was impossible. Bodies lay in the streets. In apartments. Families lived with dead relatives. Had no strength to move them. Cannibalism became common. People ate the dead. Police arrested cannibals. Executed them. But it continued. Because people were desperate. Because the alternative was death. The cold was as bad as the hunger. There was no heating. No electricity. Water pipes froze. People burned furniture to keep warm. Burned books. Anything. And still the Germans bombed the city. Artillery shells fell randomly. Killed people who'd survived months of starvation. It seemed cruel beyond measure. But the city didn't surrender. Couldn't surrender. Because the Germans had made clear what would happen. Leningrad would be razed. The population exterminated. So they held on. Somehow. And when the siege was finally lifted, in January 1944, the survivors were walking skeletons. Barely alive. But alive. They'd endured. Through 1942, the fighting continued. The bloodiest year of the bloodiest war in history. At Stalingrad, the two armies fought for control of the city. For every street, every building, every room, the city was reduced to rubble. But the Red Army held. And in November, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus. Encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Trapped over 250,000 German soldiers. Hitler ordered them to hold. To fight to the last man. But they couldn't. They ran out of food. Out of ammunition. Froze. Starved. By February 1943, they surrendered. 90,000 prisoners were taken. The rest were dead. Stalingrad was the turning point. After Stalingrad, the initiative shifted. The Red Army began to push the Germans back. Slowly. At enormous cost. But pushing back. In July 1943, at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, the Red Army defeated a massive German offensive. Destroyed hundreds of German tanks. And from then on, the Red Army was on the offensive. Pushing west. Liberating Soviet territory. Pushing into Eastern Europe. The Soviet people endured suffering almost beyond comprehension. Over 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war. 27 million. More than any other country. More than all other Allied countries combined. Millions of soldiers. Millions of civilians. Entire cities were destroyed. Thousands of villages were burned. The Western Soviet Union was devastated. And the nature of the German occupation made it worse. The Nazis implemented policies of deliberate extermination. Einsatzgruppen, death squads, followed the advancing German army. Shot Jews. Shot communist officials. Shot anyone they deemed dangerous. Over 1 million Soviet Jews were murdered. Entire communities wiped out. German forces burned villages. Shot civilians as reprisals for partisan attacks. Hanged people in public squares. Used forced labor. Starved prisoners of war. 3 million Soviet POWs died in German captivity. From starvation. From disease. From exposure. From deliberate neglect. The Germans didn't see Soviet people as human. Treated them accordingly. And this hardened the Soviet people. Made them fight harder. Hate deeper. Want revenge. Soviet women contributed enormously to the war effort. Worked in factories. Produced weapons. Served in the military. Over 800,000 women served in the Red Army. As pilots. Snipers. Tank drivers. Machine gunners. Medics. The Night Witches, a regiment of women pilots, flew bombing missions at night. In flimsy biplanes. Dropped bombs by hand. Were incredibly brave. Soviet women snipers killed thousands of German soldiers. Lyudmila Pavlichenko alone killed over 3 100. Women drove tanks, commanded units, fought and died alongside men. The entire society was mobilized for war. Everyone contributed. Everyone sacrificed. Slowly, painfully, the Red Army pushed west, liberated Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, pushed into Poland, into Romania, into Hungary, into Czechoslovakia, and finally, in April 1945, into Germany itself, into Berlin. The final battle was fought in the ruins of the German capital. Soviet soldiers fought their way through the city, street by street, building by building, raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. On April 30th and on May 8th, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The Soviet Union had won. Had defeated Nazi Germany. Had survived the most terrible onslaught in history. But the cost was almost beyond comprehension. 27 million dead. Millions more wounded. Traumatized. Entire regions destroyed. Cities in ruins. The economy devastated. It would take years to rebuild. Decades to recover fully. But they had won. And the Soviet Union emerged from the war as one of the two great superpowers. Along with the United States, the Red Army occupied Eastern Europe, half of Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Stalin used this occupation to spread Soviet control, to install communist governments, to create a buffer zone, a protective belt around the Soviet Union. The countries of Eastern Europe, liberated from the Nazis, found themselves under Soviet domination. The Cold War was beginning. The confrontation between the Soviet Union and the West that would dominate the next 45 years. The rise of the Soviet Union was complete. From revolution in 1917 to superpower in 1945. In less than 30 years. It was an epic journey. Tragic. Heroic. Terrible. Inspiring. All at once. The Soviet Union was built on grand ideals. Equality. Justice. A workers' paradise. Freedom from exploitation. But it was also built on terror. On mass murder. On lies and oppression. Millions died building socialism. In famines. In purges. In labor camps. In war. The cost was staggering. And yet, the Soviet Union achieved remarkable things. Defeated Nazism. Industrialized a backward country. Spread literacy. Provided healthcare and education. Put people into space. Became a superpower. These achievements are real. Can't be denied. But neither can the crimes. The millions dead. The freedoms destroyed. The lives crushed under the weight of totalitarianism. What can we learn from the rise of the Soviet Union? Perhaps that grand visions can inspire, can mobilize, can achieve. extraordinary things. But also that the ends don't justify the means. That you can't build paradise on bones. That systems that deny human freedom, that rely on terror, that treat people as means rather than ends, are fundamentally flawed. No matter how noble their stated ideals. The Soviet Union lasted until 1991. 74 years from the revolution. And when it fell suddenly. Collapsed. Dissolved. The great experiment was over. But its legacy remains. In the countries that were part of it. In the people who lived through it. In the lessons we can draw. About power. About ideology. About human nature. About sacrifice and suffering and survival. As we sit here tonight, in the quiet, reflecting on these events, we can appreciate how fortunate we are to live in relative peace, relative freedom. We haven't had to make the terrible choices those people made, haven't had to endure what they endured. But we should remember them, remember their struggles, remember what they built and what it cost, so we can learn, so we can do better, so we can build a world where such suffering never happens again. The story of the Soviet Union is a human story of millions trying to survive, trying to build, trying to believe. Some succeeded, many didn't. All were shaped by history, and their story is part of ours, part of what we need to remember and understand and carry forward. Rest now. The night is quiet. The story is told. The rise of the Soviet Union from revolution to superpower is complete. Sleep well. Tomorrow is a new day, and history continues.